Hey everyone, it's Dave from Imaging Resource, and this is the month of mirrorless for sure. We're here in Hawaii with Canon at the reveal for their EOS-R. It's their first full-frame mirrorless, their first serious mirrorless, I'd venture to say. And it's kind of an interesting beast. It's we're talking about 30.3 megapixels. There's no in-body stabilization, so that differentiates it a little bit from some of the competitors. But it's clearly aimed at the Sony a7 III or the newly announced but not shipping yet Nikon Z6. It's aimed at about a $2,300 price point for body only. So I said 30.3 megapixels, and it's interesting. It's a dual pixel AF camera using Canon's long established on-sensor phase detect technology, but it's the spec is for 5,600 autofocus points. We'll get to what that actually means. Let's just say there's not actually 5,600 points you could select. As you can see, it's compact. It's got a nice grip on it. This seems to be a trend with manufacturers that are going to thinner grips, so it's easy for people with smaller hands to get around it, but it's also comfortable for people with large fingers like myself. And there's a nice amount of space between the body and even the large lens, and we'll see some of the lenses. These are big lenses we're talking about here. This happens to be the 24-105 f4 kit lens that we'll be selling with it. Nice lens. We'll talk about the optics in a bit. Other than that, gosh, it's got a, here we go. It's got a flip out tilt swivel screen, which a lot of people are going to like. Some people will hate, but it's great for vloggers or someone who's trying to do their own video and monitor what they're doing. Very sharp, nice screen. It's also a really fully touch-enabled interface. It's nice. I feel like the touch on this works like it was actually designed in as opposed to being an afterthought. We'll cover more of the user interface stuff in a little bit. Let's see, what else? SEPA battery life of 370 shots. It uses the same old Canon batteries you've been familiar with for a long while. You get about 2 hours and 20 minutes of recording in video mode. We'll talk about video. Actually, Jaron will talk about video because he's the video guru and he is here this time, so I don't have to speak for him. And then also interestingly, I'm going to turn the camera off and pull the lens. And when you look in there, what you see is a shutter. Imagine that, a shutter covering the sensor. This is something that it's kind of like, duh, you wonder why nobody did that before. There must be something about the mechanics of the shutter that makes it more difficult, but you've got a shutter protecting your sensor when you pull the lens off, which is a good thing because with the shutter open, it's a dust magnet. All right, so I mentioned AF. That's one of the more interesting points of the camera. Let's take a look at that. So first off, I mentioned 5,600 AF points. Okay, look, there's the AF point. There's not 5,600 of those on the screen. What it refers to, though, is there are 5,600 selectable positions, and I just did the touch AF thing unintentionally there. So as I'm working the arrow keys on the back, up and down, left and right, and you can see it moves in small increments. Well, each one of those increments counts as a selectable AF position. So that square obviously has a bunch of little dual pixel AF points within it, and you can move that around in fairly small increments. But if you look at just the size of the square and compare it to the screen, there's actually about 143 points of that size across the screen. When the camera's working in a zone AF mode, you'll see those lighting up and it'll pick out however many of those correspond to the part that's in focus. But the only way you get that 5,600 point selectability is by using the arrow keys in the back of the camera. So it's a little bit of a marketing thing, I think, but nonetheless it is fairly flexible. I mentioned I accidentally touched the screen and got the touch AF going. This is nice. You can touch and drag anywhere. Also, with the camera to your eye, looking through the viewfinder, you can sneak your finger up, put the LCD back on the facing out on the back panel, and so while you're looking through the EVF, you can touch and drag around to move the AF point. And that's kind of a nice feature that it makes it very easy to pick the AF point, or if you're doing subject tracking, you can select a new subject, let it lock in, and then go from there. Also, we get in the user interface. I'm not sure if we'll have time for it on this video or not, but you can choose whether you want to have the entire screen active for the touch and drag, or you can select quadrants or lower half or something like that. So this really only works if you're a right eye shooter, but with your eye here and your nose hanging off the side, maybe you want to just use like the left side of the screen, or the right side of the screen to get in there and drag the points around. So that's a really nice feature. So as I mentioned, it's dual pixel AF. That's Canon's unique technology where each pixel is split into two pieces that it can use to do autofocus by looking at opposite sides of the lens and also gather exposure information. Now, I asked the engineers, these supposedly 5,000 points, are they line or cross or what? And the answer was they're line points, which is just the same as the Nikon Z7, which I guess makes sense. That's been the case with dual pixel technology all along. The pixels are divided along a horizontal axis, so that's what you get. The question is it really going to focus though? What do you do if you have horizontal detail? What the engineers said is that really, yeah, if you happen to have something with only horizontal detail and you just got it barely, exactly perfectly aligned with it, then it might not focus. But the same as the Nikon folks said, if there's even just a little bit of rotation, then that horizontal detail is going to cut through the points and it'll actually be able to focus. Another factor about this that's interesting, I asked again the engineers if this is a hybrid AF system or is it phase detect only, and it is phase detect only, which again is another differentiator relative to the Nikon. The Z7 will do phase detect and then contrast detect sometimes to fine tune. The Canon engineers seem to be proud of the fact that their dual pixel technology is accurate enough that they don't need to do a contrast detect phase, which also means that when you get the older EF lenses mounted on there, we'll talk about older lenses and adapters in just a moment, but when you get the older lenses on there, they're going to work just the same as they always have on a traditional phase detect DSLR. It'll be interesting to try it in the field a little bit. We haven't had a chance to really get it in a dim condition so far, but we were kind of amazed at the spec that the Canon says that the low light sensitivity is -6 EV with an f1.2 lens. Now that is really, really dark, and presumably with brighter lenses that weren't so bright, it might not focus that dark, but dang, -6 EV is really pretty special. In terms of speed, it's a little hard to tell. We'll get one back in the lab when we come back from this trip, and we'll do some tests. Our sense is that it's pretty quick. It doesn't feel blazingly fast. Some of the folks here have been commenting that it's just astonishingly fast, and you can't even see it focusing. It happens so quickly. I don't think we'd say that. Jaron and I both were talking earlier, and it seems like it's quick enough, but I wouldn't say it's like unbelievably fast. However, compared to their traditional SLRs, as you might expect from the price point, this isn't coming in at the really high end. This isn't meant to be a 5D Mark IV replacement or a 1DX Mark II replacement. This is coming in somewhere more in the range of where a 60, like a 60 Mark II might be. As I said, it's about $2,200, $2,300 body only, and it seems like the performance in the terms of autofocus is probably in that range. Talking to the engineers, they said that it depends a lot on the subject. That the R series with an R series lens on it, our RF mount lens, in some cases it actually be faster than a 5D Mark IV or 1DX Mark II, but in other cases it's going to be slower. They didn't really specify what those cases were, but I have a feeling that if you're a sports shooter, you're probably going to still hang on to your 1DX Mark II. This has some obvious advantages of being a mirrorless. You have a silent shutter mode, so you can get silent shooting, but it's probably not going to be your first choice as a sports camera. So let's talk about the new mount, the new lens flange. Again, I got the sensor exposed here, but what the heck, don't do this at home. So it's the same diameter as the previous EF flange. It's a 54mm inner diameter, but what obviously is different is the flange depth. And so the distance from the surface of the flange, from the face of the flange to the face of the sensor is 20mm. Now that's a good bit deeper than Sony or Nikon. Sony's 18mm, Nikon's 16, and we'll talk about that a little bit because it sounds like the mantra these days is, hey, big diameter flange close to the sensor. That's going to have all sorts of benefits for you optically. And here we are, we're at 20mm. Why are we at 20mm distance? Well, I asked the engineers that, and they said, well, actually the first consideration for them was the ruggedness of the mount, and they felt that to have enough mass in the body, enough of the casting around the flange itself, they really wanted that 20mm thickness. But that's putting the lens further away from the sensor, right? Well, actually not necessarily, because there's two factors. There's the flange distance, which is the depth from the face of the flange to the face of the sensor, but then there's the back focus distance, and the back focus distance is how far it is from the rear element of the lens to the sensor. Now this is the kit lens, that 24-105 f4, and the rear element's recessed in there a little bit. But interestingly, if you look at this monstrous 50mm, what is this, 1.2, this look at that back element. I mean, it's right almost flush with the back of the flange. So, okay, you know, here's our flange. So from the flange to the sensor, that's 20 millimeters, but we're sticking out there a good 2-3 millimeters more. So the actual back focus distance is a whole lot less. Maybe it's only 16 millimeters, so 17, 16, something like that. And so it really wasn't an impediment, or it isn't a problem that they're 20 millimeters. It's just that they've chosen to arrange their optics differently. So they went with 20 millimeters to get the ruggedness on the mount, but then they play with their optics to put the rear element fairly close back. And I guess that maybe there's something to be said that, well, it's a little bit dicey having the rear element that close. Yeah, I can actually sit this down on the table without it scratching anything, but it's kind of close. But that's the story with the mount. It's a complete new mount. They are going to have complete compatibility with their EF lenses. They say not only no reduction in performance for an EF lens working on this camera compared to an SLR, but in some cases the performance may be enhanced. So one of their goals obviously was to have complete compatibility with their EF lenses, and in fact they've done just that through this EF adapter. So they've actually got 3 versions of adapter. I should back up a moment though and say that they claim that the EF and EFS lenses running on the R series, the EOS-R, are going to be at least as performant as they are on SLRs. They may be enhanced in some ways. Again, they didn't really specify how, but at least there's no reduction in performance. Now for the adapter, they've actually got 3 different models. This is a model that has a control ring on it. Basically the plain vanilla adapter is just that. It's just an adapter, a dumb chunk of metal with some contacts on it. And the nice thing is that's only going to sell for about $99. One step up from there, they have this, which has this control ring, which is a feature on all of the R series lenses, the RF lenses, is that you can use it as an additional control on the camera. And we'll get into the user interface a little bit more later. We've been kind of bemoaning the lack of a dedicated ISO button, and you can program other buttons on the camera to serve that function. We've actually been assigning ISO to the ring on the lens, and so this is a very useful adapter. Like I said, we'll get into the user interface. There's kind of a dearth of buttons. There's a lot of it's programmable, but it would be really nice having an additional control. So I think this is going to be a very popular product, $199. And then the next step up from here, there's a version for $299 that has a drop-in filter holder, and it can come with either a circular polarizer or a variable ND filter for video work that Jaron says is dope. So he'll talk more about video later, but that's kind of a nice feature. So 100% compatibility with the EFs. This just bolts on the back. We got a monstrous, where's that lens? I love that front element, 11 to 24 millimeter super wide zoom, and just slap on the adapter and put it on the camera and it works perfectly. So one more point on the new mount. Check out the contacts here. We've got our traditional 8 contacts here, and then slightly recessed and over to the side we've got 4 new contacts. So the deal with that is they wanted to be able to increase the speed to have a lot more bandwidth between the lenses and the camera. And in fact, one way that they're using that is that the new lenses, they carry lookup tables internally that have all of their optical correction information in them. So when you're doing distortion correction, CA correction, that kind of thing, when you first attach one of these new lenses to the body, it reads the memory off of the lens with all the distortion correction information. And so they wanted to have a lot, and also for focusing, they wanted to just have a higher bandwidth connection. You'll see that there's some feedback between the camera and the display, so you see the focusing distance all the time. So they needed a higher speed connection, and that's what these 4 contacts are about. But I got thinking, gee, why do we need 4 contacts? You can put a high-speed serial bus. I mean, you've already got a ground signal here somewhere. You could just have like 1 signal line, and that's going to give you the high bandwidth connection you needed. So again, I asked the engineers about that, and it was interesting. This is somewhat about future-proofing, that actually, they didn't say how many, but not all of these 4 connectors are actually being used currently. They're there for some unspecified future purpose. So that was very interesting. But the big thing is that the extra contacts, as with the new Nikon Z series, is that it gives them an additional channel. All these contacts over here are really low bandwidth, just very kind of basic information that's being passed back and forth. This stuff here takes us into the truly into the digital age for the lenses, and gets a lot of communication between the camera and the lens. Oh, and so another thing about these lenses is focusing. I mentioned these things are massive actually, and this is the 50, which is pretty big. The 28 to 70 f2, check this out. This thing is insanely huge. It's also pretty performant. Again, the engineers, I asked them, like, how much better are the these new R series lenses than the EF, given that we've got this new mount and the larger diameter, the short back focus and everything. And they said that this 28-70 at f2, they said would be about as sharp as the 24-70 f2.8, which is a very highly commended lens. And then if you stop down this monster a little bit further, it's going to be even sharper at f2.8. But then look at this 50. So I don't think it's really come across on the video, but the focus element of this thing, I'm going to stop talking for a moment. And you may not be able to hear it or see it. It's just insanely massive. This thing is moving back and forth in here. We noticed the other night playing with it that literally the balance of the camera shifts slightly as this thing focuses. And so it's obvious this camera, the engineer said they, here the prime attention or prime goal was a lot of sharpness and really good bokeh. Same story with the 28-70. But interestingly, the kit lens, blowing a little dust off it here, the kit lens, the 24-105, this has been optimized for AF speed. And in particular how they did that, this was interesting to me. They talk about having a nano USM motor. So USM is the ultrasonic motor. It's kind of a vibrational thing. It's subject for another day. But what's interesting, I asked them, so what's nano about this? They say, well, it's very small. I mean, okay, small, everything's nano these days. It turns out what it is actually is, traditionally USM motors have been a ring around the lens, and this is this ultrasonic vibration that happens, and it causes it to move one way or the other. What the nano USM does, it's a little linear device, and the thing's really small. We've got a, hopefully, when we come time to post the interview with the engineers, I'll have an illustration I can show you guys. But they said that's what let them make the barrel of this lens so much smaller, is they have these little linear USM actuators that are quite powerful and very fast. So the kit lens, the 24-105, should be a very fast focusing lens. So let's talk about the user interface just a little bit. It's a mixture of familiar and unfamiliar. Because it's a mirrorless and a smaller body, we've lost a whole row of buttons down here. So there's not as many buttons on the camera, and the mode dial is entirely different. There's a button on top you push to say mode, and then you can scroll between selections here. We've got, full auto, green zone, program, shutter, etc. And you keep scrolling, it just wraps around. This kind of bugs me a little bit. To get to movie mode options, you have to touch this info or punch the info button in the back of the camera, and now you have your movie shooting modes. Again though, you can't just sort of wrap around, you have to touch info to get back. Now notice there's a new option here called FV, or Flexible Priority AE. That's kind of interesting because what it does, it's kind of a combination of the time value, aperture value, and also exposure comp and ISO here. Now, you notice it just flipped over to auto. I'm not sure why it took a moment to do that, but you start out and it's kind of like we're in program mode right now because the camera is automatically selecting the shutter speed, the aperture, exposure comp, everything. Now what we can do, notice there's a little icon here that says that right now it's selected to aperture, and if I rotate the front command dial, I can select a different aperture value. So now I'm basically in aperture priority shooting. I roll this back controller and I can select a different one. So now the aperture is set to f13, but for the exposure time, currently it's auto. I can roll the front command dial again, and now I'm basically in manual shooting mode, in that I'm choosing both the shutter speed and the aperture. I haven't touched the exposure comp, and the ISO is auto. I can reset whichever one of these I'm currently on. If I take the rear four-way controller and hit the up button, it resets it to auto. If I hit the right arrow button, it resets everything to auto. And I'm a little bit up in the air about this. My initial reaction was I really liked it, because I will frequently switch back and forth between selecting a shutter speed or an aperture. I'll want to go over and fix an ISO or something like that. And so I like the fact that I can hop back and forth between these things, reset them, move around however I like. What I discovered though in using it is, and again this may be programmable, the camera's really, the buttons are insanely programmable, you can put just about anything anywhere, but the default for being able to reset these things is this rear four-way controller here. And I found it awfully awkward because I have my finger up at the top of the camera. I'm selecting different options and modes and whatever, but then to reset something I have to drop my thumb all the way down on the back and hit a button there to reset. So like I said, I'm a little bit up in the air about this. I really like the idea of FV, and it corresponds to how I use a camera a lot of times, but that having to reach down to the back to reset something is just a little bit awkward. And again, this could just be unfamiliarity. There's probably a way to program that some way differently on a different button, but an interesting point there. Now there's another really intriguing aspect to the camera's user interface, and that's this thing up here. I don't know how well you can see it, the light's a little bit odd, but this is, they call the manual function bar, I believe. And it really makes us think of the touch bar on the MacBook Pro. So this is a programmable control here, and there's actually three parts to it. There's a left arrow, a right arrow, and then a center slider. Now right now, I think by default it lets you select ISO. So this might be an answer also to the lens ring for ISO, you know, take place of the dedicated button. But as I touch this and slide back and forth, it's selecting different ISO values. Now right now, the two side buttons, it's saying not available because I haven't programmed those. It turns out you can program these for completely different things. So let's go into the menu and take a look at that. And conveniently, I'm on Custom Function Menu 4, Customize MFN Bar. And so now there's, this actually is set to user customization. I thought I'd reset the camera. Normally, I think maybe I'm honestly not sure. I think it defaults to ISO speed, which is kind of where we are at. Let's suppose we're on ISO speed. So right now it's saying that this slider function selects ISO. The left button is going to pick a fixed ISO of 100. The right button is going to pick a fixed ISO of 6400. And I can choose those, go down here, hit it. I can decide what I want to do. I punch info to get the detailed settings. So let's say I wanted that right button to actually be an ISO of, let's scroll it over here, of 12.8. I probably could have done that from the arrow keys too. Set that, and so now the right button is ISO 12.8, left is 100, and the center will scroll between. So let's go ahead, go back, and see what happens when we have that selected now. So right now I'm at ISO 6400. I slide around here, I can choose different values. I tap the left, it goes to ISO 100. I tap the right, it goes to ISO 12.8. So that's pretty cool, but it turns out you don't have to have these be the same things. Let's go to, I saw it down here before, user customization, and now these can be completely different. So let's make the sliders ISO, and actually I've been playing with this before. I made the left button Servo AF. Let's just pick some other random function on here. Let's do, let's have it enable the histogram. And then I can take this one here, and this was doing manual focus peaking, and I've got lots of options I can go through here. I'm rotating the top dial, the main command dial as they call it, and that's choosing the types of parameters at the top here, and then once I'm on one that I'm interested in, then I can tab over, use the touch function to grab it. So let's say make that custom white balance. So now I've got ISO on the slider, the left tab brings up the histogram display, and the right tab brings up custom white balance. And again, we go back out to the main screen. Here's my ISO, left tap. There's the histogram, which is all black right now, no surprise, and right tap, there's my custom white balance. So I'm not sure what to think about this. On the one hand, it feels kind of odd and awkward. It's like the huge potential of the MacBook Pro touch bar, but in actual practice, I never use it and it just gets in the way. On the other hand, I could see where this could really be useful for some people. One of the Canon tech reps was talking about using this as a way to control racking the focus doing video. He could pick a new focus point, tap one of these, and it would do the rack for him. And as you can see, we can program just anything imaginable into these. There's ISO, rotate through, take your pick, just about any camera function you can put on one of these, whether it's the slider or the right or left button. So that's kind of an interesting function. I think we'll have to use it more in practice and more than anything hear from actual practicing photographers out there to see what they think about it. But it's an interesting user element. I'm not sure, we think, well, maybe we would have liked to have had about 3 more buttons up there, but let's see how it goes. It's certainly an innovation anyway, so kudos to Canon for that. All right, so a couple other points. One is autofocus modes. I just punched the focus point select button on the back of the camera, and I'm going to use my finger to select this here. So here's the different modes that we've got. There's a face tracking, which is kind of nice, and there is an option on it for eye sensitive or pupil detection, or whatever you might call it, that's kind of like Sony's eye tracking AF. So far, we haven't had a chance to work with it a lot. It just keeps switching off on me. I guess it's just a timer thing. I'll bounce back and forth here to keep it going. Our sense is that it's maybe not quite as sure-footed as Sony's. Also, the iDetect AF is not available in continuous shooting mode, which seems a little bit odd. I'm not sure what the reason for that would be, but it might just be a bandwidth limitation in the processor. But at any rate, so we have face detect with IAF. Oh, come on, come back here. Sorry about that, folks. We've got a single point AF, expanded area AF, expanded area around the point, and then we have 3 different zone AFs. There's a sort of a central zone, there's a vertical zone, and a horizontal zone. And these will work. I'm not sure I can do this with taking the lens off here. Let's see what happens. And nothing's in the area to be focused on, so this may not work anyway, but it'll show you little clusters of points. And as I mentioned before, yeah, there's not 5,000 of those points there, but in the single point mode you can move them around. So that's a zone AF. Let's go back and I will take it into, here's like just a central zone. It's doing the same thing. Let's punch back there again, and then here's an expanded area. And I mentioned the ability earlier to drag touch the AF point while you're looking through the viewfinder. I found that really nice in the AF tracking mode, in that it'll show you when it's tracking a subject. It's got a little box around it, and then to select a new subject, I could sneak my finger up, underneath my cheek there, or whatever, below my eye, move it around until it got onto a new subject, and it shows you a little reddish square. I'm not sure I can really do that now. I'm not going to try actually, but you get a little drag half circle kind of, or partial circle. You put that over your new subject, you touch the shutter button or whatever, and then it starts tracking that subject. So the drag touch is really nice. Those are the AF options that you have on the camera. And then very basically, we're not going into like the tracking and how sticky it is and that sort of thing. It's somewhat similar to the traditional Canon SLRs. It's not as deep an autofocus system as something like the 1DX Mark II, but it's certainly appropriate to kind of a 62 class of camera. Now another thing, we were complaining about lack of ISO button and that sort of thing. So there's this one button on the top of the camera, the MFN button. And when I push that, it gives us this display. And as before, as typical, I can use the rear dial here, the top rear dial, to select between the different options. And then once I'm on a given option, I use the main controller to select what the value is that I want there. So here's continuous shooting, motor drive, etc. The thing, kind of a gripe here is that I don't know why can't we just, oops, sorry, I lost it there. Why can't we just add other functions on here? There's ISO, shooting, drive mode, one shot versus servo AF, white balance, and this is flash exposure comp. Why can't we, as we can program everything else on the camera, just tack some more on there or take some of those off? I'd really like to see that. It seems like that could just be a firmware update, but we'll see what comes. The top panel display here, it's a high contrast. It looks like, I don't know, like one of those e-ink type displays. I can press this little button here and it'll cycle between displays. If I press and hold, it inverts it and also turns on a backlight. And it's kind of nice. It's a very subtle backlight. You can see it in daylight. The display itself is a reflective rather than a transmissive display, so it holds up very, very well in direct sunlight. But the backlight's very nice. It's a very subtle light. It's not going to blind you at night, but it's going to be make it very visible. So that's a nice little readout. I tend not to look at the top panel stuff a lot. And really, echoing something I think I said earlier, Canon's design goal with this camera was, from a user interface standpoint, was to make it so that you could just use the camera with your eye at the eyepiece, not to have to take your eye away to look at a menu or select something. Pretty much everything you should be able to do on the camera through the viewfinder. And speaking of the viewfinder, it's a great viewfinder. It's very bright, very crisp. I heard one other of the press say that it's like looking through an optical viewfinder. I don't think it's that, but it's a very decent EVF. One last thing, the card slot. There is a card slot. It's got a UHS 2 compatible card, but one single SD card. Nikon caught all kinds of flack for this on the Z7. I expect Canon's going to catch an equal amount for this. Again, though, for this camera, it's maybe a little bit of a different case in that Canon's not really positioning this as, the 1DX2 mirrorless or something. They're not really aiming it at a totally professional necessarily market. It might be as a second camera for a pro, something like that. But nonetheless, I know a lot of people are going to be complaining and griping at them about the single card slot. So that covers pretty much all the stuff I had to say about it. I think I want to turn it over to Jaron, who's our resident video guru. He's been standing behind the other cameras recording as I'm talking, and he'll share a lot of some of his thoughts about video and what his experience was, shooting and working with the camera today out on the grounds.
Thanks, Dave. I have been using this camera all day today. I'm going to use it again all day tomorrow because there's a lot more I need to do, but I do have some stuff I want to talk about just as a kind of a walkthrough of what to expect with this new Canon camera. When it comes down to it, video shooters are really looking for only a few subsets of things, and a lot of that comes down to the sensor. And in this case, since it's pretty much exactly the same as the 5D Mark IV. They said they made some adjustments to what they put in front of it, but the actual sensor itself is the same as the 5D Mark IV. It goes without too much saying that we're getting kind of what we got with the 5D Mark IV. That is to say, 4K is maxed out at 24 and 30p, and we don't really get any slow motion even in 1080. I mean, 60p is good, but not great, especially when you're forced to shoot in 1080. So in 4K, you get two shooting options. Actually, let me bring that up. On this screen, you can see all of our shooting options, and you have 4 in 4K, you have more in full HD, and then you have some in the regular HD. And I feel like we can pretty much, at this point in 2018, completely ignore these three that are in 720. No one will shoot at this, no one will watch in this. This is kind of a bleh area. In full HD, we actually have quite a few options. We have the normal 24 and 30p and 2997 and 2398, and in a couple different options. You have the All-I, which is a more data-dense file for better quality, but you also have the IPB, which is a lower file size, and you know what? Odds are you probably won't notice a huge difference unless you're shooting in log. You'll also see here that Full HD gives you the 2997 in a smaller, light format if you want to get even more lightweight than you were when you're shooting in the IPB to the regular. What I mainly shoot in is 4K, and I don't know if you can see it much on the screen or not, but you can actually see the screen is jumping. That's that crop factor that the 5D4 has and that this camera brings with it as well. Any of these 4K options all have that crop factor. It's 1.7x. Oh, also what you might see here is that the dimensions of this video are UHD, which is different than the 5D4 and the 1DX Mark II, which shoot in cinema, which is a larger frame. I'm not sure why they decided that they were actually going to go to regular UHD. I think that's great. This is what most people are using and shooting in, and it's the same ratio as 1080. So it's nice to see that I don't have to constantly be cropping in all the time and adjusting for that. This doesn't shoot in MOV either, it shoots in MP4, and it does that at 480 megabits per second in 8-bit internal at 420. You can do a 10-bit C-Log external HDMI clean to 422 out, which is really nice. That's actually another thing they added here that you didn't get in the 5D Mark IV. You did get C-Log, but you didn't get 10-bit 422. Comparing to the Nikon Z6 or Nikon Z7, those don't record N-Log internally at all. You have to use an external recorder. With the Canon R here, you can get both log in internal and external. The benefit of external is of course a higher bit depth, which means better for color grading, but if you don't want to do that or you didn't have that option, you can still get the 8-bit C-Log, which is really nice to have. I want to talk a little bit about a weird but true fact that I found with this camera. So I recorded a same 11-ish second clip in both C-Log and in standard, and what I found was that the clip file size was dramatically different. In standard, an 11-second clip is about 721 megabytes. In C-Log, that same 11-second clip is 308 megabytes. So something about C-Log is actually like a lighter file than what standard is producing out of this camera. Not sure why, but I'm gonna probably be able to talk a little bit more about this later when I do a full video review, and I'm looking at the clean HDMI out 10-bit C-Log files to see what those look like. Some notes on use with this camera. This camera actually has focus peaking, which is kind of a first for this format or style of camera, and certainly for a full frame, mainly stills shooting camera, and that's really great for video shooters. However, I am a little bit waffling on my opinion on it right now. I'm not super sure what the deal is, but in certain circumstances, I'm getting great focus peaking performance where I can see everything just exactly how I want to. And in other cases, I can't see any of the peaking lines at all. And I'm sort of just flying blind, which I'm not sure what's causing that. I thought maybe it was being super wide open, but I just tested a little bit ago and I'm getting them here. So it might actually have to do with how much light is available. What it does have and what I can use in that situation in case that happens is the focus guide. This is the feature they brought in from the cinema line, and it brings like these two lines together and shows you how close you are to hitting the focus point, and then when you are, it turns green and shows you that yes, that where you are, that's in focus. And that is a super handy tool, and I really, really like that they put it into this camera. Combined with great focus peaking, that should result in excellent ability to pull focus in exactly the way you want to without worrying about going too far or coming in behind. One other thing that is another weird but true on this is most cameras that Canon has been producing lately have a built-in intervalometer for time-lapsing, which is awesome. Everyone loves that. If you forget your remote, you're not, up a creek. Unfortunately, this camera doesn't do it 100%. And what I mean by that is you can set it up, it'll do a time lapse, but it won't produce JPEGs or RAWs for you. It'll only produce a 4K final movie. So it's there, but now it's not as useful as it once was. You can't really do what you want to do with time-lapse, which is get all of that beautiful raw data to make a really pretty image into a movie. Instead, you're stuck with whatever the camera decides is going to become your 4K readout. So I'm not sure what to think about that, and I'm really not sure why they did that. So as Dave mentioned, and I kind of have to too, again, because it's very important to video shooters now, is in-body image stabilization, and this camera does not have it. They do offer some of their lenses with lens stabilization, which if you're a Canon shooter, you're used to, but some of them don't have it. This one, for example, this is the 50mm, does not have any option for optical stabilization, and that can be complicated if you want a handhold. In fact, earlier today I tried to handhold a lens and it didn't have any optical stabilization in it, and there's nothing on the sensor, and I was getting a lot of motion that I wasn't used to because I haven't had to deal with that in a long time. So it's worth noting that this is the only full-frame mirrorless camera on the market without in-body image stabilization. Dave also touched on this ring right here, which can be customized to do whatever you want. I've been using this as ISO because I prefer a quick way to get to my ISO change rather than having to use the manual function button or the other ways you can get to it. And since we don't have a dedicated ISO button, this has been working for me. I like this thing, and I especially like it on the adapter, because with the adapter, this gives me that functionality on lenses that don't have it. So if I decide to put an EF lens on here and I need to change my ISO, well, if I don't have this ring, now I have to do it in the way that I didn't like doing it before, which is trying to dig around and find it here. So for me, it's going to be a tough pick between this and that aforementioned one that has the drop-in filter, because I really, really like the drop-in filter with the neutral density filter. I don't have one here because Canon only had a limited number of them and someone got in line before me and grabbed it before I could. But I used it last night, and it has like this little gear dial on it that really smoothly transitions between the stops of the neutral density filter. And it just pops in and out. It's really nice, and it should be noted, I think that these are pretty small, and they don't really make the EF lenses much bigger. So I like that, and the one with the drop-in filter isn't much larger than this one. It might be just a slight bit thicker. And I think the Nikon one's kind of large, so this one seems nicer and smaller to me, which is, worth praise. Other than that, it's really been more kind of like a shooting experience with the 5D Mark IV. With the 5D Mark IV, the focusing kind of feels pretty much the same. And I kind of now want to take a moment to call out, you've probably seen it pop up a few times if you've been watching the video, but this main camera, the first overhead one, is the new EOS-R. And so the video we've been shooting with it has, been from that camera. The other camera, which is the over-the-shoulder one, and at one point it was kind of over to the camera left, that is a Canon 1DX Mark II, and honestly, they look really good together. So these two cameras pair well. This camera can be added to a current EOS shooting line and it'll fit right in. The two standard profiles look really excellent next to each other, and since this can shoot log, the EOS-R, now it can also match with the other EOS cinema cameras. I really wish the 1DX2 shot log too, then we could shoot everyone happy family together. But this is a good step in the right direction.
Well, so that's pretty much the story on this. We've got a lot more to learn about it. We could keep talking and babbling for hours, but you've probably heard enough. And we're going to be digging into it, as Jaron mentioned. We've got a full day of shooting tomorrow, different venues. We've got several of us here that are going to 3 different shooting venues. So we'll have lots more material, footage, samples, and early next week we should have some lab samples for you from this. So stay tuned. It's a really great looking entry into the full frame market, and I think there's a lot more coming behind this. Thanks for watching.